September 1943, dawn on the Dnieper. German soldiers held their breath, aiming across the river. At the sound of gunfire, the soldiers exchanged silent glances. Suddenly, a familiar sound approached. The formation broke, turning the march into a rout. Through the morning fog, a steel giant appeared. It was a Soviet T-34 tank unit, hastily dispatched. The lead tank as the tracks hit the bridge. A deafening roar consumed the area as the Kiev railway bridge erupted in fire and smoke. Simultaneously, a signal flare went up, signaling the German withdrawal's completion. Thus, the Soviet plan to move tanks across the bridge failed. In summer 1943, Nazi ambitions were crushed at the Battle of Kursk. The Red Army's counteroffensive pushed west. However, the Battle of the Dnieper ahead would be one of Deep Tour's bloodiest. Now, in the Moscow Kremerie Ritz to Ruins operations room, the air in the Stavka was tense. Marshal Zhukov clenched a red pencil, speaking as he traced the Dnieper River. Comrade Stalin, a direct push against the enemy will mean immeasurable losses for our army. If we strike south from Kharkov and Izium through to Dnepropetrovsk, we can encircle the enemy's southern group. That way we could manage with half the matches. Stalin lit his pipe. As the flame flickered, the silence deepened. Zhukov later said, "The pipe smoke was a compass for the meeting." After the sound of tapping ash, Stalin's voice cut through the room. "Comrade Zhukov, we can't spare time for matches. We must oust the fascists immediately." At those words, Zhukov placed the nearly broken pencil down and held his breath. Among senior Soviet commanders then, cold slang was used. Broken pencil, washed lost battalion, burnt match, washed depleted company. Zhukov breathed deeply and replied softly, "Understood, Comrade Stalin, but to push straight to the Dnieper, we need at least triple our current pencils." Stalin glanced at reinforcement requests and mercilessly ran a red line through them. "I approve 60% of the request. The other matches will be given after you reach the Dnieper." And with that, the discussion ended. Zhukov was, in fact, one of few generals who could directly challenge Stalin. But he knew from experience that there was a line not to be crossed. In later years, Zhukov recalled, "At that time, we were exhausted from many battles. But all of us, from soldier to marshal, passionately wished from our hearts to quickly liberate our Ukrainian comrades from the fascists." However, just a decade before, the Ukrainians awaiting liberation were deemed enemies of the people, suffering famine. Driven by the ironic word liberation, Red Army soldiers marched into hell. Meanwhile, on the German side, the Hitler-Manstein relationship had cooled. At this time, Hitler reportedly let his entourage call Manstein the retreat marshal, and Hitler himself scoffed at his reports. Thus, their 8th meeting in Zaporizhia was filled with mutual distrust, despite superficial politeness. When Manstein explained the need for a frontline retreat, Hitler retorted in a low voice, "Marshal, do you forget the Donbass's value? If we lose it, Turkey abandons us. That cannot be allowed." Manstein sighed inwardly. That fantasy again? Though Turkey's entry to the Eastern Front in 1943 was nearly impossible, Hitler was fixated on it. "Mein Führer, a strategic retreat to the Dnieper River is the only way. Otherwise, Army Group South faces annihilation." At that, Hitler gave a dry smile. "Retreat again, Marshal? Your maneuvers are always backward. Fine, the Dnieper it is. We will build the Ostwall and crush them. Until then, absolutely no retreat." Hitler's words grew heated. But to Manstein, it was an escape from reality. The army had submitted the Ostwall Eastern Wall construction plan in Jan 1942 after failing to take Moscow. But Hitler himself had dismissed it then. If strong rear defenses existed, soldiers would surely retreat easily. Despite that belief, he now clung belatedly to the plan. However, in Sept 1943, after the Kursk defeat, the situation was entirely different. The construction order was given August 11th, but it remained in the survey stage. Neither time to wait for its completion, nor forces to defend it existed. However, without this man, Germany falls Manstein knew the gap between Hitler as a public idol and the real Hitler before him. Nevertheless, or perhaps because of it, the clever Manstein realized no one could replace Hitler. The later 20 July plot, an attempt to assassinate Hitler. Manstein did not join this plot, which involved key figures like Kluge. In a diary entry after being invited, Manstein's bitter conviction is noted. In any case, Hitler has the people's and soldiers' complete trust. He is the only one they believe in. Manstein patiently continued persuading him. Extracting concessions from a fanatical, fantasy-driven dictator by repeatedly stating facts required superhuman mental strength. Finally, on September 15th, permission was granted. Conditional on leaving a bridgehead near Zaporizhia, Army Group South could fully retreat to the Dnieper. However, the decision came too late. During that week of debate, the Red Army advanced unabated, closing in. They forced a desperate crossing on the Desna River. With waterproofing, a T-34 could theoretically travel submerged at 5 meters. However, that was just a theoretical figure. An actual submerged crossing was a deadly gamble. During a submerged crossing, with the periscope useless, they navigated by instruments in darkness. Waist-deep water filled the tank, with the crew holding their breath in the freezing current. 3 hours later, the tank unit reached the opposite bank. But the Great Dnieper, up to 12 meters deep and 3 kilometers wide, could not be crossed this way. Furthermore, since both sides had destroyed them, only a few heavy-duty bridges remained. However, for the attacking Soviets, one bridgehead would let them send a flood of tanks to encircle and destroy the retreating Germans. Therefore, the German army had to destroy the bridges before the enemy took them. But only at the moment their last million troops had crossed. Too early meant abandoning their own troops, too late meant aiding the enemy. Thus, the Dnieper struggle became a race. It became a desperate between retreating Germans, pursuing Soviets, and the cruelty of time and fate. Zhukov issued the Dnieper Race Directive, making the fronts compete to capture a bridgehead. In this desperate retreat, Manstein had to make an agonizing choice. He gave a strict mobile defense, order to Panzer and Panzer Grenadier divisions. First, a furious artillery barrage would shake the earth and blind the enemy. Next, elite units would execute a short, sharp charge. When a crack appeared in the confused Soviet lines, they fell back to the defensive line set by earlier units. Of course, the rearguard tanks faced extreme danger and heavy losses. Following the road paved with their blood, the main German force fled relentlessly west. Simultaneously, in a 30-kilometer-wide strip on the Dnieper's east bank, they seized all supplies and burned everything. This was likely a mix of cold military logic, denying enemy resources, and the occupiers' resentment. Meanwhile, the Soviet army, intent on securing a bridgehead, used every possible means. On the Dnieper's west bank, seized the Bukrin bridgehead. The parachute troops, clutching that order, awaited the jump command. At that time, the parachute troops were a self-proclaimed elite force. However, the operation on September 25, 1943, was fatally underprepared. The result of this negligence can only be described as tragic. Into the black rain-filled sky, about 4,500 paratroopers jumped. But below, on the ground, the German army awaited its prey. A Soviet soldier who saw that hell recalled it as follows. Instantly, the night sky filled with burning torches. Our comrades burned in the sky. Before they could fight on the ground, they burnt to death in the air. Stalin, on receiving the report, criticized the operation scathingly. A large-scale night parachute drop that showed the planners' incompetence. However, the failure's root cause was arguably Stalin himself, who ordered a hasty river crossing. Still, the bloody march continued. On September 29th, the strategic point of Kremenchuk on the Dnieper was liberated. However, on streets that should have been celebrating freedom, a Red Army soldier was speechless. On the streets, enraged women with axes and rakes dragged Nazi soldiers by their hair, shouting curses in Ukrainian. They pushed Nazi soldiers into a hole. Hewists, local collaborators, met the same fate. A dying fascist shrieked, "At my home, I have Kinder." The women shouted back, "What about ours? Puppies? So what? Throw them in." At that moment, what power could have stopped the hammer of justice falling upon the fascist executioners? Such scenes of women who lost family detaining German soldiers became common from autumn 1943. These impromptu people's courts were tacitly allowed as war crimes retribution. As German forces were swept from the Dnieper's east bank, Hitler wanted to preserve a foothold for a counterattack. Thus, the Führer ordered the Zaporizhia bridgehead, at all costs, must be held. However, the XL Panzer Corps commander, Henrici, decided to retreat. Manstein also approved this bitter decision. The key to evading Soviet pursuit was demolishing the dam. However, it was a merciless decision that could involve friendly forces in the retreat. At 8:12 p.m., the concrete giant in darkness trembled and a chain of flashes ignited. The flash flood swallowed the Soviet crossing points, halting their ability to pursue. Thus, the German army's withdrawal from the Dnieper's east bank was complete. The Wehrmacht's press stated the same day the front line was straightened by a planned withdrawal, calling the retreat a success. Meanwhile, in Moscow, 224 celebratory guns fired 20 times. However, as usual, the immense Soviet bloodshed for that victory was not small. But the real tragedy was to come. The Soviet army had two options. One was to gather bridge-building materials and annihilate the enemy. The other was to cross the river at once, despite sacrifices, before the enemy regrouped. The latter was chosen, a forced crossing to create a bloody path. One theory is that Stalin was obsessed with recapturing Kiev by Revolution Day, November 7th. Liberating Kiev by Revolution Day offered immense propaganda value. Propaganda was prioritized over soldiers' lives. Thus, on a 750-kilometer front, the Soviet army began a simultaneous do-or-die river crossing. Here, we follow a tank crewman's harrowing testimony from the fierce battle for the Dnieper's west bank north of Dnepropetrovsk. We needed boats, but there were none. The Dnieper seemed endless, the far bank hazy, maybe 800 meters across. Sensing the coming hell, everyone was silent. The soldiers built crude boats and rafts, using straw-stuffed greatcoats as flotation devices. Fishing boats, logs, barrels, anything that floated was used. To follow the order and to survive. Just then, a high-pitched roar. A large formation of German planes dived mercilessly. An iron rain fell, bombs gouged the earth, and giant water columns erupted. Still, the order was unchanged. Cross to the right bank under fire. It was hard to stay sane. Under shells and bombs, we built a huge raft and loaded a T-34. Then, bathed in hellfire, we rode into the river of death. It was a mad tightrope walk. The wet raft was slippery, and any tilt could drag the 30-ton tank to the riverbed. Each time it tilted, we threw ourselves left and right to maintain balance. All the while, merciless bombs rained down like hailstones. This was our crossing. Sapper units also fought desperately. They struggled to build jetties and pontoon bridges amidst a hail of enemy bullets. Many, under German machine gun fire, vanished into the Dnieper's muddy waters. In early October, many Soviet divisions were reduced to half or even a quarter strength. It was truly a blood-soaked advance, grinding soldiers' lives in a millstone. However, in exchange for these sacrifices, the Soviets secured 23 bridgeheads on the West Bank. The hellish river crossing had barely succeeded. Thus, on November 6th, before Revolution Day, the Red Army recaptured Kiev, the Ukrainian capital. But that land of victory was far from joyful, dominated by silence and emptiness. One soldier recalled, "At first, no one was seen. The fascists had driven citizens out, and survivors hid in basements, catacombs, or had fled to forests. Over 2 years under occupation had plunged lives into despair. The population, once 1 million, had dropped to about 186,000. The German occupation's policy was to eventually wipe the Slavic city from the earth. A woman's diary describes those days. We were not living, we were existing. The young were lured by a wonderful job in Germany or forcibly conscripted to harsh labor. One day, all town men were arrested, 5 were hanged. It was warned that unrest meant 1 in 10 men would be executed. As the war worsened, the Nazis frantically tried to erase all traces of their atrocities. The bodies of tens of thousands of Jews and others massacred at Babi Yar were exhumed and burned. For this demonic disposal work, prisoners from the Syrets camp were mobilized and then thrown into the flames themselves. It was an act seeking to burn their very souls. Around the time of the Kiev recapture operation, an inflammatory article by writer Ilya Ehrenberg circulated among Red Army soldiers. The article's headline, "Kill! The Germans are not human. If you haven't killed one German a day, you have wasted it. Kill the German. If he lives, he will rape a Russian woman. Show no mercy. Don't hold back. Kill." This article ignited a burning hatred for the German army and planted a desire for revenge. However, they who swore to justice would soon sink into a hateful abyss. The fall of Kiev. The news infuriated Hitler, who began to search for who was responsible. The one Hitler singled out was the hero Hermann Hoth, commander of the 4th Panzer Army. Hitler reviled Hoth as a bird of ill omen and ringleader of defeatism, and dismissed him. Hoth was a general loved by his men, nicknamed Papa Hoth. This dismissal was less about his failure and more of a scapegoating. At the same time, it revealed the deep rift between the front line and Hitler. Furthermore, Manstein and Hitler's relationship also worsened throughout these battles. What fueled the Führer's suspicion were his entourage's whispers. Manstein seeks his own glory over loyalty to the Führer. This enraged Hitler more. By late 1943, the rupture between them was a matter of time. Now to summarize the battle. The Battle of the Dnieper is often overshadowed by Stalingrad or Kursk. This may be because its front was so vast and dramatic moments are few, making it feel elusive. However, this battle was one of the Great War's bloodiest. During the Battle of the Dnieper, August 1943, about 4 million troops were committed. Soviet losses are estimated around 1.3 to 1.7 million, while the German side is estimated at 300,000 to 500,000. Combined, they had 2 million casualties. As a result, while the Wehrmacht avoided a major defeat like Stalingrad, it lost vast territory and was pushed west. On the other hand, the Soviet Red Army broke Hitler's eastern wall and liberated Kiev, a strategic objective. However, as was typical for this regime, it was a victory paid for with immense soldier casualties. Now, as the war turned decisively against Germany, world leaders began discussing the post-war era. In late November, the same month Kiev was liberated, a conference was held in Tehran, Iran. At a dinner with Roosevelt and Churchill, Stalin, sipping his drink, quietly spoke. After the war, we must physically eliminate at least 50,000, perhaps 100,000 German officers. To these words, Roosevelt replied with a smile. Isn't that too much? How about 49,000? However, Churchill, with a bitter look, scraped his chair back and stood up. Until Stalin explained it was a joke, he refused to return to his seat. To understand this, one needs the implicit premise. That is, the bloodstained memory, the Katyn Forest. In early 1943, about 22,000 Polish officers' bodies, massacred, were found. The Soviets claimed it was a German crime, but Roosevelt and Churchill knew where the blood stench truly came from. Considering the prior conviction, Stalin's 50,000 executions was not a joke, but a probe. Depending on their reactions, Stalin may have been resolved to make it real. Was it the schemes of giants or a matter of whim? The war was certainly marching towards its end,